You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and we're discussing new US Secretary of State John Kerry's first foreign trip. Kerry today announced millions of dollars in aid for Syrian rebels after a meeting with the Friends of Syria group in Rome. It is the latest stop on what he has described as a listening tour to 9 European and Middle Eastern countries to gauge views on the Syrian civil war, Iran's nuclear program, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The emphasis on traditional American allies in Europe and the Gulf differs from his predecessor Hillary Clinton, whose first trip abroad as Secretary of State was to Japan, Indonesia, South Korea, and China. On Tuesday, Kerry met Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Berlin and discussed issues including Syria, as well as American plans for missile defense systems in Europe and Russia's ban on Americans adopting Russian children. Kerry is now due to travel to Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. So, what have we learned from Kerry's trip so far, and what kind of change does his appointment represent for American foreign policy, if any? Joining me in our London studio to discuss this is Dr. James Boys, an Associate Professor of International Political Studies at Richmond University. And on the phone from Moscow, we have Fyodor Voitolovskiy, Senior Research Fellow at the World Economy and International Relations Institute at the Russian Academy of Sciences. So I'd like to start by asking Fyodor Voitolovskiy the following question. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said he thought Obama's foreign policy would be more constructive in his second term after his meeting with Kerry. What do you think he meant by that?
I think that, I think that he meant that United States and Russia would find more compromises on different foreign policy topics. Including Syria, including ballistic missile defense issues, and others. So I think that the period of misunderstanding, I hope so, the period of misunderstanding and period of exchanges of Parliament announcements about like Magnitsky Act and like act of Dima Yakovlev and other serious but very harmful for relationship between two countries. This period is passing, and we will try to find more constructive way of developing our dialogue because we have serious issues, serious common challenges on our agenda, such as Afghanistan, such as situation in Syria and the Middle East, North Korea, and others.
Do you think there will be any change in the kind of personal relationship between Mr. Lavrov now with Kerry and his previous relationship with the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton?
I don't think that we should understand international politics in categories of personal relationship. But I think that Hillary Clinton, she had sort of approach, a sort of vision of international politics, and especially it's reflected in Russian-American relations, but in other issues also. And Kerry has quite different political experience. And he has another vision of international relations, and he had previous experience of interaction with his Russian colleagues when during his work as a senator, and after that, I think that.
Do you think, Mr. Voitolovskiy, do you think that Russia and the US can start to work together now over the Syrian issue?
I think that we should continue dialogue, and the dialogue will develop, and it will lead us to some political results. I'm not sure that we have we have common understanding of political results we want to see in Syria, both sides, I mean. But I think that we could find compromise on a Syrian issue, which will be based on UN Security Council decision and which will based on UN Charter.
So what's the view from Russia on Kerry's announcement today of direct but non-lethal assistance to Syrian rebels and millions of dollars in aid to sort of carry out governance in areas that are no longer under Syrian government control?
I don't think that it was a right decision. And I don't think that this decision is leading us to compromises I tried to explain before. But I think that at the same time, suggestions of political dialogue, initiatives of a dialogue between Syrian opposition and Syrian government, with participation of other sides, including European Union, Russia, United States, and others, will lead us to some state of this situation, which will change these dramatic issues. But we should, both sides and all sides in this problem, they should use more inclusive approach to the situation in Syria, because it is more than complicated, and it includes different interests, and it includes different positions and countries outside Syria and surrounding Syria and from other regions. It is very, very complicated issues, and I don't think that last words of Mr. Kerry they were right.
Okay, and what other kind of burning issues are there that Russia wants to talk to Kerry about? What, over the next 4 years, is going to be the main substance of the dialogue, do you think, between Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Kerry?
First of all, I think that we should mention issue of ballistic missile defense. And I suppose that suggestion of declaration, of issuing of two declarations of one declaration of two presidents could be compromised on this issue and could help us to not to make problem of ballistic missile defense and not to make realization of American and the transatlantic, I mean NATO program of building ballistic missile defense system in Europe. The most burning problem of our relationship. The second issue I would like to mention could be trade and investment, and I think that here we could find more common interests, and we could see serious development of contact between our countries. And I see a very good perspective for it in the context of Barack Obama initiative of transatlantic free zone for trade and investment, which was supported by José Manuel Barroso and was one of principal topics of John Kerry's tour in Europe. I think that Russia could participate in some ways in this partnership, but not as a member, of course, but as a partner of this future Euro-Atlantic free trade and investment zone. I think that third and most principal issue is Afghanistan, because it puts challenges for United States, for Russia especially, for countries of post-Soviet area, and for European Union also. And this one is the most principal in the context of finishing of the operation.
Okay. Okay, those are the views of Fyodor Voitolovskiy, Senior Research Fellow at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Thanks very much for joining us. I'd like to ask Dr. James Boyes, who is with us in our London studio and is a Middle East expert. Actually, John Kerry's first stop on his tour was here in London, where he reaffirmed the so-called special relationship between the UK and the US. What did we glean from Mr. Kerry during his brief appearance here?
I think what was most telling was the fact that he said categorically it was no accident that his first stop as US Secretary of State was here in Great Britain. He's very much an Atlanticist. He follows on the heels of Hillary Clinton, who was perhaps a very different character. And so what we're going to see, I think, is within the State Department a far greater emphasis perhaps on the US relationship with Europe, as opposed to maybe we saw in the Pacific in the first term. A lot of people here in Europe were very concerned by the idea of a Pacific pivot coming into effect under President Obama's watch. And I think what you see in the appointment of John Kerry, who was, of course, not his first choice, but who we've got in any way, is very much like an old-school diplomat, someone who's been schooled on the Hill. He's been in the Congress for 30 years. He's been chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This is someone who can play diplomacy very, very well, and I think that we in Europe in particular should welcome his appointment.
Does this mean then that President Obama's pivot to Asia is over?
No, I don't think so. But one of the things I've been trying to remind people about for the last 4 years is that Bill Clinton tried something very similar when he came in 1992. He talked about trying to, push the Pacific envelope. His first stop as president were over there. He didn't come to Europe for the first 12 months of his presidency. And what you saw was a real reticence and a hesitancy in the Pacific to embrace Bill Clinton's foreign policy agenda. And I think you could make an argument that something similar is happening with regard to Obama and the Orient. If you look at the news we were just reporting earlier on about the tensions between the United States and China, for example, over cyber warfare. It's just a tit-for-tat spy versus spy concept, which is just developing, and you can see how that could develop into a new, I dare to say it, Cold War, effectively. But here in Europe, he doesn't have those problems. He can come to Europe, just as Clinton ended up pivoting back to Europe in the 1990s. I think you can see a parallel with what Obama's doing, and his inadvertent choice of John Kerry, I think, reflects that.
But Kerry is now on his way to the Middle East, where he'll be talking to Turkey. He'll be in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood is basically in power. And then he'll be in the Gulf, and those Gulf countries are most worried about the spread of the so-called Arab Spring. So what kind of message is he going to be giving to those Middle Eastern governments?
Well, I think it's important to note that he's going there essentially to lay the groundwork for President Obama's trip to the Middle East very, very shortly. Obama's been criticised for not having visited Israel as president. That's being rectified in March. So the idea is to sort of visit these countries and say, look, the United States stands firmly behind democracy. It puts America in a different position, of course, because if America tries to export democracy or support democracy, often it's not going to get the result it wants. If you've seen in Egypt, for example, it wouldn't necessarily have chosen the Muslim Brotherhood as a partner of choice in that part of the world. It's what it's got to deal with it, and it's trying to make the most of it.
And now over to our Washington studio. Well, our Washington studio doesn't appear to be with us just yet, so Dr. James Boyes, I'll just ask you a further question. John Kerry, he wasn't the first choice for this job, you say. Why wasn't he?
Because the Obama administration's first choice was Dr. Susan Rice, who was and remains the the United States ambassador to the United Nations. The idea was to promote her following Hillary Clinton to be the new Secretary of State in the second term. She got trotted out on a series of talk show hosts just before the election to discuss the Benghazi incident in which Ambassador Stevens was killed. It was seen that she was politicizing the issue on behalf of the administration, and while she was not involved in the Benghazi operation, she became the fool person for the administration. She went to Capitol Hill to testify about it, and it was made very, very clear that she could not be confirmed, so she had to pull out.
Okay, we're joined on the line from the States by Robert Nyman, who is a policy director with Just Foreign Policy. Hi, Robert, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks very much for joining us for this discussion about John Kerry's first foreign trip. What is the view from Washington about Mr. Kerry's trip to Europe and the Middle East?
Well, the marquee thing, as you know, is that's being advertised is the discussions about Syria and the shift that the U.S. is currently doing, which seems to have two parts. The public part, the sort of the marquee thing, or the marquee thing, is this decision to provide more so-called non-lethal assistance to the Syrian opposition. But the other part, which was forecast earlier, was trying to have a new round of discussions with Russia. That's what Kerry initially said. His plan was to try and break the stalemate in Syria, was to have a new round of discussions with Russia. And there remains in Washington extreme skepticism about the Syrian armed opposition and the influence of al-Qaeda-like groups within it, increased influence of al-Qaeda-like groups within it. So it's not necessarily clear if this really represents a more confrontational posture by the U.S. And indeed, the relatively cool reaction of the Russians, I think, to the U.S. announcement indicates that this doesn't necessarily represent a more confrontational policy in the U.S. Part of the story is that part of the argument that's being made in the United States is, okay, we're all concerned about these al-Qaeda-like groups, but the U.S. Isn't exercising influence in the situation against the al-Qaeda-like group. So that's part of the argument that's been made in the U.S. that the previous policy wasn't working. So there is maybe some room for another push for a diplomatic resolution. I think it's important to realize that there aren't two sides here. There's at least four sides, because there's people both on the government and the opposition side that want to have some kind of political resolution, and there's people both on the government and the opposition side that don't want to have any kind of political resolution, want to have winner take all. And that's one of the big obstacles, is the fact that there's people on the opposition side that want to talk to the government and want to have a political resolution, and there's people obstructing that. So it may be the case that what the U.S. is trying to do now will or could help in the long run produce a political settlement. That's the marquee thing. Of course, non-marquee things, the Iran nuclear talks have just started again, and they've agreed to continue them sooner rather than later. And there's been some movement in the Western position. They dropped the demand to close Fordo. They're talking about a horizon in which there might be greater sanctions relief in the short run, and they would not demand that Iran cease all enrichment of uranium to 20%. So this is, not close to a deal, but maybe it's the end of the beginning of the U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations. And Kerry is someone who historically was associated with pushing more strongly for a diplomatic resolution. Early in the Obama administration, he said, we should just recognize that Iran has a right to enrich uranium and get it over with. So it's possible that that Kerry will represent a shift, or will be part of a shift towards more serious diplomatic engagement with Iran. We'll see. That's by no means guaranteed, but it's certainly a possibility.
What other changes do you think that John Kerry's appointment represents for the way America deals with the rest of the world?
Well, I think overall, people with this new team, not just Secretary of State Kerry, but also Secretary of Defense Hagel, just confirmed on Tuesday, people are looking for a more rapid drawdown in Afghanistan and hope for progress towards some kind of political resolution. Obviously, Kerry's not the only factor there. You have the Afghan government pushing back against U.S. special forces and there's tremendous impatience in the United States towards ending the war. Now we also have Pentagon budget cuts, which are also pushing in the direction of ending the war. But I think that is definitely something that people are looking to Kerry to lead on the diplomatic side of, trying to not only push internally inside Afghanistan for some kind of political agreement, but working with the neighbors, particularly Pakistan, which has made some moves in the direction of supporting a political settlement. And I would expect Kerry to be a leader on trying to mend fences with the Pakistani government and get them to play what the U.S. would perceive as a constructive role in helping bring about a political settlement so that U.S. troops can withdraw from Afghanistan.
Okay, so we are now joined by Rob Sachs in our Washington studio. Over to you, Rob.
Tom, thanks so much. And Robert, just wanted to follow up with your last point there about the relationship with Pakistan. Many see that as kind of the key to figuring out how to get a grapple on the whole, hotbed of terrorism. How can we build trust with Pakistan if it's the place where they were hiding bin Laden, if they have this porous border with Afghanistan, and if many see the Pakistani army, or at least some people within the Pakistani army, as complicit with aiding and abetting terrorists?
Well, first of all, I think the premises of your question are hotly disputed. As far as we know, the Pakistani government was not hiding bin Laden. He was in Pakistan, but that doesn't mean that the government was hiding him. No public evidence has ever been produced that the Pakistani government was hiding bin Laden. In fact, we know that the Pakistani government helped with intelligence that helped locate bin Laden's compound. Now, is there a porous border between Pakistan and Afghanistan? Yes, there is. But that doesn't mean that, it's necessarily the Pakistani government's fault that that's the case. There are other porous borders in the world. After all, 40,000 people have been killed in the drug war in Mexico, many by guns traced to the United States. So there's a porous border between the United States and Mexico, too, which the Mexicans are saying, why don't you do something about this? And the U.S. says, we're doing everything we can. So that, I think, doesn't necessarily mean that there can't be cooperation. I think the political horizon, people seeing that there's a political horizon where U.S. troops are going to withdraw and there's going to be serious effort towards a political settlement that takes everybody's interest into account. I think that's what's going to solve the problem. Early in the Obama administration, there was an understanding that part of the story, not the whole story, but part of the story is India and Pakistan fighting a proxy war in Afghanistan. And there's a perception that under the Bush administration, the U.S. policy had taken a very pro-India tilt, and there should be a rebalancing to not have such an extreme pro-India tilt and take Pakistani interests into account. And Holbrooke wanted to do that, Ambassador Holbrooke, early in his tenure, and the original portfolio for his position was supposed to include India-Pakistan and working towards India and Pakistani rapprochement as a way of helping to end the war in Afghanistan. There was tremendous pushback on that at the time. So now I think there's a new opportunity to revisit these issues and try and de-escalate the conflict between India and Pakistan as one of the tools. It's not the only problem, but it is one of the problems in ending the war in Afghanistan and bringing about a stable Afghani government that represents all the main parties and ends the war.
And do you think that Kerry's leadership style will be more conducive to that?
Yes. I think that, the main story is what U.S. policy is. But having said that, Kerry does have a reputation for being low-key and not making the sort of headline-grabbing confrontational statements and having good relations with everyone. And I do think that will be helpful particularly in trying to bring the Afghan and Pakistani governments closer together, which is crucial for a political settlement, and lowering expectations on all sides, because of course there's going to have to be lots of compromise for a political settlement and ending the war. And it may be that Kerry can also be helpful with Congress. Last year the Obama administration made moves towards opening political talks with the Afghan Taliban. There was this move to open an office in Qatar. There was supposed to be a prisoner exchange that would transfer Afghan Taliban prisoners in Guantanamo to Qatar in exchange for releasing Bo Bergdahl, the only American soldier being held by the Taliban. There was tremendous pushback against that in Washington. I think a lot of it opportunistic from Republicans. People didn't want to end the war.
Okay, Robert Nyman, I have to interrupt you here because we're just coming up to the half-hour mark where we're going to have a short news update, and we will be back after that update to continue talking about new Secretary of State John Kerry's first trip abroad. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and we're discussing new American Secretary of State John Kerry's first foreign trip. Joining me in our London studio is Dr. James Boys, a US policy expert at King's College London. And in our Washington studio, Rob Jacks has Robert Naiman, a policy director with Just Foreign Policy, on the phone. Dr. Boys, John Kerry has described this trip, his first, to 9 countries in Europe and the Middle East, as a listening tour. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I was quite aghast when I heard this, because to me it brought back all sorts of memories from 1993 when Warren Christopher first came to Europe, and he said exactly the same thing. And one of the problems, of course, is that whilst Europeans are very, very keen to say, we're sort of sick of the Americans pushing us around, we want to be able to reassert ourselves, they're also very, very used to being told exactly what to do by Washington. So it's kind of that old catch of be careful what you wish for. And certainly when Christopher came over here, he'd followed on from Jim Baker, who'd been a very assertive foreign policy expert as Secretary of State. So I think one needs to get beyond the historical analogy a little bit, but it's good to see him here in London in particular. He's got a good rapport with William Hague, I think, and I think that came through very much at the press conference they had. There's some interesting things to discuss. I think there's also a lot of common ground between the governments here in London and in Washington, despite their slightly different political colourings. And I think you're going to see a good close working relationship between the State Department and the Foreign Office in the next 4 years.
But Kerry wouldn't be drawn on one issue, which is the Falklands Islands. Tell us about that.
It's interesting because, again, I think one of the problems is it's very easy to have short-term memories. What you're seeing in Washington is an attempt to try and walk a very difficult tightrope. Don't forget the United States, we're going back a long time now, but issued the Monroe Doctrine talking about European powers staying out of Western hemispheric issues. If you go back to 1982, for example, everybody talks about the love affair between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but don't forget when the Falklands conflict certainly blew up to start with, there was a lot of diplomatic shuttling around by Al Haig, who was then Secretary of State, America trying to stay literally neutral in that situation. We forget that in retrospect. We only hear about and think about the American support we got. That came quite late in the day. So the Obama administration, I think, is following an historical precedent of trying to walk a fine line between its allies in South America and its allies here in the United Kingdom. And I dare say in the end it'll do the right thing by us.
And tell us more about its commitments in South America and how that forces them to take this delicate position.
I think it's their historical ties. I think the United States has long had a very problematic relationship with its neighbours south of the border, fluctuating between almost too much influence and not enough. The whole classic sort of Yankee imperialism and Yankee go-home sentiment that gets reflected a lot. It's clearly got a lot of challenges south of the border. You heard Robert speaking from Washington a short time ago about the porous borders with Mexico. There's no doubt about it. It's a great challenge that the United States faces, and I think in terms of its balance, it's fascinating that it's long had this sort of big brother approach with regard to its neighbours to the south, but a far better relationship and a working relationship with those of us in what Donald Rumsfeld would have called Old Europe.
And how do you think John Kerry will approach trade between old Europe, as it were, and the States.
Well, this is what I thought was particularly interesting. For a long time now, there's been talk about developing something that might want to refer to as TRAFTA, a transatlantic free trade area. Certainly when John Major was Prime Minister in this country, there was the delegation that went over to meet the Clinton team in Washington and talked about this. And I believe it was Richard Holbrooke, who again Robert mentioned earlier on in a previous incarnation in his relationship with the Clinton years.